everyone. Welcome to the second last Friday seminar for this term. Thanks so much for coming and for supporting our speakers. I've been very excited for this talk for many months. A little bit of like brute force was necessary, but I think it's paying off even more. So may I introduce our current DSL, Chris Rigaud, and his, how many DSOs ago? 2, right? So our former DSO, Michael Dardeau, and have you noticed they both have French sounding last names? I love that so much. Anyway, thank you so much for agreeing to giving this talk, and I will, hand it over to them.
All right, if you know me, I like to walk around the room when I teach or present. So if I step away from the mic, please coax me back. And can everyone online hear me? Okay, Kat. Okay. All right. All right, well, we'll get started. Maybe. Is Melissa still here? Maybe I'll just use the keyboard. Apparently the slides won't advance. Well, thanks all for being here. That concludes our talk for today. Clicker stopped working. The clicker stopped working.
You're right.
And the keyboard stopped working.
What did you upset it, Chris?
Also, if you know me, I have the absolute worst luck with technology
Yes,
of
he
anybody
does.
I know. So if it's going to go wrong, it will go wrong.
The mouse, he had to click on this. Okay, so I think we just got clicked off because of Zoom. So I clicked back on your presentation and now it's back.
Now it works.
Yeah, it was just.
Thanks to Melissa and the IT team. Oh yeah, that's better. All right. Thanks again, Kat, and everyone. Thanks for being here. I will say that when Kat asked me to give this talk, I said, well, I'm probably not the person who should be giving this talk. And so as a result, I invited my friend Mike Dardeau to be here to help me give this kind of compilation of 50 years of diving safety and scientific diving excellence at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab. There are other individuals who are equally suited to talk about this today, and we will acknowledge them when we can. So this is also the first step in my attempt to preserve and capture the history of diving here at DISL. And so if there are people out in the audience, if you feel we have made any errors or omissions, or if you'd like to help out in this effort, please step forward and we will be glad to include that information in our compiled history. It's not showing the screen on Zoom, okay? Better? Okay. But now my clicker doesn't work, Kat. I already gave that disclaimer. Nope. Thanks again. Thank you. Thank you. She said something about maybe can you click on this side of the screen and then maybe it will work. Aha. All right. Okay. Okay. So let's start. What do we do? The mission of the DISL Scientific Diving Program is to facilitate the safe and effective use of diving as a research tool and provide training for scientists and students. That's very similar to the mission of the American Academy of Underwater Sciences, and we do this in 3 ways. First, we provide research support and expertise. Secondly, we provide education and training to scientists and students. And then lastly, we do a fair bit of outreach to help encourage diving and the use of diving as a research tool. This also closely aligns with a statement that's made in this paper from 2010, written by former Director George Crozer and Mike Dardeau about the Dauphin Island Sea Lab, a tale of 4 laboratories. And if you haven't read this paper, I highly encourage you to do so. It'll give you a fantastic background and history of where you are and where you work. And in that paper, they state, DISL has always tried to balance the 3 goals of research, education, and public service. All right, so some of you, how many divers in the room or online? Raise your hands, all right? How many non-divers? So we're gonna start with a little, what is scientific diving to begin with, right? Well, it turns out that scientific diving is actually defined and regulated by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, at least in the United States. And they define scientific diving as diving performed as a necessary part of research or educational activities, and on and on. Some of those are, it is occupational in nature, which means that there's an employer-employee relationship. Scientific diving is conducted by scientists or scientists in training who use scientific expertise to study the underwater world. And these things make it very different than commercial diving for construction or demolition, or for recreational diving, people who dive just for fun. What do? The role of a scientific diver is very well defined by OSHA. We are observers and data gatherers. Right? We use that specialized expertise to scientists or scientists in training, but we're really only using diving as the tool to get underwater to do our science. As a result, our diving is always mission-oriented. We do not just go out, swim around, and go diving and then consider what to do. We have a mission or a task in place before we ever head out. Scientific diving puts the scientist in the water in direct observation with your intended focus of study, right? It also allows us to be underwater and do experiments or manipulations that might not be able to be reproduced in a laboratory environment. We can do this in all scientific disciplines. Most people think about scientific diving in biology or ecology terms, but oceanography, archaeology, engineering, even diving medicine and physiology are all scientific disciplines that utilize diving as a research tool. We operate in almost all environments: temperate, tropical, under the ice at the poles, in inland and freshwaters, coastal and seawater, open ocean blue water, and even in caves and caverns. And again, our tasks are observers and data gatherers. So we are identifying or collecting organisms, measuring or quantifying different parameters, placing and servicing instruments, or using specialized tools to study the underwater environment. I could give an entire talk, or Mike and I could give an entire talk on the history of diving or the history of scientific diving. We'll just give you a couple snippets. There are anecdotal and historical records of people diving as far back as Alexander the Great, some time ago. In the mid-1800s, the scientific diving community generally agrees that Henri, and somebody who's French can help me pronounce that name better because I'm not really French, right? Henri Milne-Edward was the first recognized scientist to use diving to conduct underwater observations. A little more recently, in the United States at least, there are documented scientific diving courses in the 1920s at the University of Miami, and at Scripps Institution of Oceanography in the 1940s, scientists using commercial diving gear to conduct underwater observations. So for anybody that's in our current scientific diving class, like, how'd you like to wear that rig and walk around in the seagrass bits? Our scientific diving history also starts kind of post-World War II, what we consider the advent of modern scuba diving. And this closely aligns with the invention of the aqualung, right, by Cousteau and Gagnon. This allowed the diver to be free from the surface supplied heavy gear that we now consider commercial diving and be free swimming. And this revolutionized what we now know as scuba diving, self-contained underwater breathing apparatus, and resulted in the scuba revolution in the 50s, where scuba diving became popular for recreation, readily accessible to pretty much anybody. And it was also popularized with Cousteau's The Silent World, TV series like Sea Hunt. Most of you all are way too young to remember that, but I have the entire series on DVD if you'd ever like to borrow it, right? So we're talking like 12 years of TV. Thanks, Brian. What's a DVD? I'm sure you could stream it, but I don't know how to do that. Right. So also closely aligned with that scuba revolution in the 1950s, scientists got on board and said, hey, this is a fantastic tool. We can use this for underwater research. In the United States, we generally agree that the birthplace of scientific diving was at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, led by these three individuals, Dr. Andy Recknitzer, Jimmy Stewart, and Connie Limbaugh. After about 20 years of doing so, it turns out that the US federal government stepped in and created what they called the Commercial Diving Standard. This was an effort to protect commercial divers in the workplace, right? And Mike and I already talked about this, but I'd like to turn it over to him a little bit to talk about what the background of the OSHA scientific diving exemption really was for, and why scientists had to get together to lobby the U.S. Congress for an exemption.
Yeah, I really understand what's going on. This period is crucial because, President Nixon today, and, OSHA just said, well, these are employees, they didn't really care about students or any of the nuances of people that are in that sort of not quite blowing up stuff for a living underwater. And so they just blanket said everybody who has an employee relationship has to follow these regulations. And this is in the 70s, and these folks from Script had a system where they were actually self-regulating. They had a diving control board like you have here that monitored diving activity with approved oxygen, things like that. They collected statistics, proved that their diving was safe, and all this is pre-OSHA. And OSHA just stepped in and said, you got to quit doing things that way. You have to do it like you're a promotion. And you know how research is. You know, it's basically taking pirate population with free labor from the students. And no, you know, real employee, well, the employer-employee relationship is tense. So this created a big problem because OSHA was enforcing these regulations in big fines, things like that. So what happened was the scientific diving community started talking nationwide. And yeah, the scientific diving community started talking nationwide about this and trying to come to some kind of resolution that would allow them to continue what they've been doing for 20 years. And so the history and the story of scientific diving, whether we like it or not, is related to how that relationship with OSHA evolved. And if you don't understand that, it all seems crazy. You think, why do we do things like this? And that's the reason why. And we'll go into a lot more detail of that.
So apologies to the folks online who maybe couldn't hear Mr. Dardeau's introduction to that, but essentially he was just commenting on why we do things the way we do them, how OSHA was involved, and then how that evolved into our current scientific diving regulations. So from that effort in the late 70s and early 80s to lobby Congress for an exemption to the commercial diving standards, that same group of folks eventually established the American Academy of Underwater Sciences that serves to regulate and oversee scientific diving in the United States today. DISL was in fact involved in this effort from the very beginning, and we have over 50 years of diving safety and excellence here at our Marine Lab. From that paper, A Tale of Four Laboratories, two individuals, Dr. Will Schroeder and Tom Hopkins, were essential to the establishment of scientific diving and underwater science here at the Marine Lab, and they have a direct connection to Jimmy Stewart and the Scripps Institution of Oceanography. That's where they were trained, and then they brought that training and knowledge here to the Sea Lab. The scientific diving program here at the Sea Lab was also one of the first major grant recipients at the Sea Lab. And there was a grant from the Russell Foundation to fund 5 years for scientists and students at DISL to take part in the 1970s Hydrolab program, where its scientists were living in the ocean for days and weeks at a time. And that tradition was then carried forward in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s by Mike Dardeau, who's here with us today, and we're going to let him speak here in just a moment. And then just a quick snapshot of DISL diving activity and statistics. And we do have records further than this, but this is the compiled history that we have digitized from 1992 to 2024. And so the blue line are number of dives per year. The red line are number of divers per year. And this is important because The diving is supposed to follow the science. And so the peaks and valleys you see are directly related to grant funding, scientific activity, right? And that's why there's not a standard progression of more diving. It's always this ebb and flow of grants, scientific activity, scientists, and students. So now I'll introduce and allow to speak Mr. Mike Dardeau, who served as the DISL Diving Safety Officer from 1992 to 2015. Mike didn't really want me to do this, but a little bit about him. Mike was a graduate student here, started in the late 70s. He then continued on as a research technician in the early tech support days, served as DSO here from 1992 to 2015, during which time he supervised nearly 15,000 dives. He was served in the recreation, in the national community with the American Academy of Underwater Sciences, on the board of directors as the statistics chair, as the treasurer, and was essential in founding the AUS Foundation, which supports our student scholarships. He was awarded with the Conrad Limbaugh Award for Scientific Diving Leadership in 2018, is a member of the first class of AUS Emeritus DSOs in 2023, and in 2024, we named a scholarship opportunity after Mike to help our community continue diving safety, professional immersion, and excellence in the AUS community. So without further ado, Mike Dardeau.
Okay, so this all started when I was a wide-eyed teenager and I wanted to swim with dolphins. That's not true. I was I was a fishery biologist. I spent a lot of time setting gill nets and pulling trawls in and things like that. I didn't have too many illusions about diving in Vermilion Bay and finding dolphins. So, but after 40 or so years in the business, never saw any dolphins. Had lots of dives, no dolphins. I went on a trip, a recreational diving trip to San Sal. And you can see, I didn't even know this dolphin was there. It came up behind me. And I was just now recognizing that he was there. So it kind of surprised me. And the dive master happened to get a shot of it. How do I
I can run the slides for you, or you can run the slides.
Go ahead and run it. As Chris said, the early folks in this were around the 70s when the lab was first getting started. If you know the history, it wasn't originally here at Dolphin Island. It was in Bila Battery, and gradually moved here as this old Air Force base became available. And it was really, I mean, there are way more people in this room than worked here or went to school here or anything back then. There were about, maybe on a good day, you could round up 15 people. And they were in all these buildings. And we had this whole 30-acre complex all to us. But yeah, and everybody knew each other. There was a new car in the parking lot. That was something to talk about over morning coffee. And the faculty was kind of and I wasn't there. I didn't come till 79. So I'm kind of speaking about the years before that. 77 rather. I'm kind of speaking about the years before I was here, but I knew a lot of these people before they passed away, worked with them for many years. And they were proteges of Jimmy Stewart, as Chris said. And I want you to kind of visualize Jimmy because he was a character. He was, when I knew him, he was pretty much an older curmudgeon. You know, he had been diving since the 50s, and I didn't run into him till the late 70s. And he was an older, curmudgeonly guy. His most prominent thing was a big shark scar that he had been attacked by a shark, and he had a big scar across his arm. And so, you know, it was pretty obvious. And he just was kind of OCD about everything. You know, he was the archetypal diving officer, I think. And so he had one of these people, Tom Hopkins, who will show up again in this story. Tom was a graduate student. He's an ex-Marine. He'd gotten out of the Marines, served in Korea, gone to Scripps to get his PhD, and he was a student diver with Jimmy Stewart at Scripps. And he recruited another student to come to Scripps and work on physiology. They were both kind of physiology types. And that was a young George Crozier, who was director of this lab for 30-something years. So they were both at Scripps in this 60s period when science diving was really coming into its maturity. And there was another fellow who was at UC San Diego, which is adjacent to Scripps, and that was Will Schroeder. Well, they all got their PhDs and went their way. George ended up coming here. Hopkins wandered around in Florida for a while. Will went to Texas A&M, and then when the lab moved from Biolatry to here, that's when several diverse programs at various universities started to come together as the consortium. And you'll see on some of these old documents, you'll see MESC. Are you guys familiar with what MESC is, Marine Environmental Sciences Consortium? We made a concentrated effort to brand as Dolphin Island Sea Lab many years ago. And so some people just know that. But the consortium concept is what got us here initially, where the member institutions were providing support to the lab. In fact, the biggest part of the budget came through member institutions at that time. So let's move on to that. I mean, they've passed. Hopkins and Schroeder have both passed, but these guys started the original scientific diving training, and they were doing it for that Hydrolab program. They had the Hydrolab grant, and Hydrolab's what's known as saturation diving. One of the constraints of diving is you have a limited amount of time and a limited depth that you can operate in. And if you are in that environment, your body's taking on gas. And you have to either come to the surface before it gets too full of gas in your tissue, or you have to stay down there until the tissues are saturated. Once you hit that point, around 12 hours or so, you can't take on any more gas. And so your decompression time is going to be the same as if you only spent an hour and a half there. All right. So saturation diving puts you down in the environment under pressure, and you can stay there for as long as you get support, food, air, place to go to the bathroom, place to sleep, etc. And that's what the habitats provide. But what they really give you is time to work underwater. You know, otherwise you're confined to the specific times and depths that your gas uptake allows. So they need support, and not everybody got saturated. It kind of, I'm sure it's like this on everything. You know, the PIs get the first stuff. They get to do the get in the habitat and live in the habitat, that sort of thing. And the students are essentially support divers at first. So what they're doing is bringing down food and carrying stuff back up. And if they need some kind of equipment, a camera or whatever, they bring it down. And that's a short dive, so they're not getting into that whole saturation thing. But the people that are down there are stuck. They can't come out until it's time to come up very, very, very slowly, like over the course of a day or so. So they started training students as support divers, and some of them eventually, go ahead, Chris. Some of them eventually got into the habitat. There's a support diver there, probably. Although the way it works, it's dry in there, of course, and you just suit up and go out. They call those excursions. Not really a dive, because your dive started when you first went down, because you're under pressure the whole time. So if you make 3 excursions a day, that's what normally you would call a dive, but the rules are different. Eventually, some of the students made their way in. This color picture, I came across this in a magazine, and I was in graduate school with the guy in the gym shorts there, and that's a DISL fish on his gym shorts. I know that because I played basketball with him. Actually, we were roommates for a long time, and so I recognized him right away. And then I started looking at the others, and these are some of the original techs and graduate students from the lab in there. The guy against the bulkhead his name is Jay Shapiro. He was heavily involved in the dive program. The next one is Steve Heath, who eventually became the head of marine resources over down the road, and was actually the first non-Auburn student to not only head marine resources, but to ever work there. So he was a trailblazer. These are pictures of Will. That's Will putting stuff in his ears. You can imagine it's kind of a humid environment in there. You have to protect your ears. They did all kind of silly stuff to, getting in and out of wetsuits. Wetsuits would never really dry out. And you're cold all the time because the water temperature, even in the tropics, is 80, 85 degrees. And so it's always bringing your body temperature down. Can't go out there in just the skin or bare. You got to put a wetsuit on. The wetsuits are being compressed because they're under pressure, right? They're just foam, and all those little bubbles in the wetsuit are getting squeezed down. So the wetsuits are getting thinner and thinner as well. And if you've ever been on an ocean cruise, they send the styrofoam cups down with the CTD, and they come back miniature, like little shot glasses. Well, the same thing happens to wetsuits. So to get into them, they use dishwashing liquid. So you'll see pictures of people sporting dishwashing liquid all over themselves and then sliding into their wetsuits. Next one, please. And these people were heavily involved with the national community even back then. This was in 1975, just before I got here. There was a meeting here out on Dauphin Island, and I was here 30, 40 years, and I never knew about this until I was going through some old papers in an old file somewhere and found the minutes of this meeting, and recognized not only a lot of the names of the people that were there, but even people that I went to graduate school with. And they met here to write a letter to Senator Lowell Weicker, who was at the time probably still is the only friend of ocean science in Congress. And he was instrumental in establishing NOAA, actually. And so we kind of had his ear as a community. So these folks got together here, and in retrospect, this was in 1975, before AAUS, before OSHA. There were 2 future AAUS presidents there. There was Hydrolab program staff. Of course, we were involved in Hydrolab at that point. 3 faculty from here, 5 graduate students. Scientists in the Sea was a program the Navy was supporting over in Panama City. And Greg Stanton from Scientists in the Sea was there. He was a AAUS board member. And then faculty from A&M, FSU, FMRL, USC, and the New Jersey Marine Consortium were also there. So kind of a big meeting here on Dauphin Island. And the consensus was they were recommending to Lowell Weicker that we establish regional scientific undersea facilities, because to get that extra time at depth so that you could conduct experiments, so that you can do surveys. And they suggested, and this is something that AAUS is still to this day trying to make happen, is to involve, rather than being lumped in with OSHA and people who blow stuff up underwater, they want to be involved with NSF and UNOLS on the academic side. And that can be the, an overlying structure for scientific diving. And unfortunately, it went unheeded. Next one. Yeah, so moving forward a little bit, OSHA's starting to threaten and act like they really want to regulate science diving, and people decided at that point that in the science diving community that we better make OSHA aware of our statistics, right? And so they wrote to Crozier and Schroeder and their other contacts here at the lab from California, Jimmy Stewart, and some of the other folks up there, wrote to get information on how many dives. And so you'll see the support dives here. And then on the back side of this, they have the excursions, but they had 311 man days saturated. So you can imagine there were a lot of excursions during that period. And there were no injuries during that. And because decompression sickness is such a physiological response, it's on the spectrum with, like, all you people are going to respond differently to being saturated by gas and then desaturated. So it's a numbers game, and you could get into trouble following all the rules. So the fact that they can self-regulate to this extent, this kind of record is what allowed OSHA to later grant a partial exemption to science diving. So as the Hydrolab money ran out, another person arrived, and I mentioned him earlier. Tom Hopkins had been chair of the department at University of West Florida, and he got mad at them because they wouldn't let him do what he wanted to do. And so he just picked up his toys and left. And a lot of his toys were compressors and dive gear. He had a program and a grant from what was then BLM. I forget what it is. You know, BOEM? Is that what it is now? Yeah, it's been moved around to different federal agencies, but at the time it was the Bureau of Land Management that regulated offshore gas sales. And so he had a program or a grant from them to look at environmental impact. So he had people dredging and trawling and diving all over the Gulf. And he brought all of that, plus all of his graduate students, the dive locker and everything, to here. And when I got here, basically everything said grunt on. And the made up acronym for that was Gulf Research Underwater Naturalist Team. But what it really was the sound you make loading boats, because that's what they did, is load boats and unload boats. So, yeah, and I mean, everything had grunt on it. Chris, you probably have tools in the dive locker that still say grunt on them. Buckets, boxes, sea chests, everything had grunt on it. I finally, after 40 years, it's probably not all there anymore. But that's Tom there on top of a submersible. That's me in the lower one. And that's Charlie Lutz standing next to Tom. And he had a big role in, he was kind of Tom's right-hand man in running the dive locker in the late 70s or so, late 70s, early 80s. And actually, I think that's Charlie in the picture underwater at the Florida Middle Ground. So that was kind of their special project among all this other stuff all throughout the Gulf. Was every quarter we would load up a U-Haul van. Am I going over? Probably. No?
You're fine.
We would load up a U-Haul truck, not a van, a truck, like a moving truck, full of dive gear, grunt, carry it down to St. Pete and put it on an FIO vessel there, the Bellows,
and then go to the Florida Middle Grounds, which was south of Cape San Blas and west of Tampa, and dive for 10 days, 3 dives a day for 10 days. Then we go back into St. Pete, get more food and water, come back out, do it again for 10 more days. Then we go back to St. Pete, load the truck, come back. And so that's sort of why it took me 5 years to get a master's degree, because I was never around to do the schoolwork. So anyway, as Chris said, working underwater is really just a matter of doing the same thing that terrestrial science do, but it's harder because of those depth time considerations that we talked about. But we do surveys and transects just like regular terrestrial scientists. We do collections and experiments. We just have to tweak it a little bit. And that's part of the role of the science diving officer, is to make things easier for people. We have further limitations here of low visibility everywhere. Even training dives are difficult because of the low vis locally. But yeah, we run cores down through coral reefs by hand. That's a 15-foot aluminum drainage pipe being pounded down into a reef with a fence pounder. And when you get it on down, you attach these handles, twist it, and get it down a little more. And then you cover it with a plastic cap to create suction. And now comes the other part. Now you got to pull it out. and believe it or not, they do come out. And we've gotten corals back 3,000 years old from these 15-foot pipes. Another adaptation is blue water diving. If you put people in the middle of the water column, they can't orient well. It's hard for them to know what depth they're at. And as we said, depth is really important. You can't exceed certain depths. So what we do is we put them on little tethers, like my dogs when you walk them, leashes. So the leash goes back to that ring, this ring right here. The ring's got a little loop in it, and the tether has a weight on it. So if you swim toward the loop, the weight falls down, and you can, you have free movement. If you swim away from the tether, then it pulls up and eventually it hits that little loop and you can't go any further. So you make the tethers 10 feet long and you put the ring 10 feet above where you want your divers to be, and then they can't go any deeper than that. And because you're focusing on little bitty things in the water column, you're not really looking around. Blue water is an area where sharks like to be. And so instead of having a traditional dive buddy, you have somebody who just sits at the ring and untangles the tethers and watches for sharks or any other kind of trouble. So that's your dive buddy, because he's not collecting anything. He's not doing anything. One more, Chris. Aquarium diving is another specialty. This is mostly about contamination control in a lot of ways. You don't want to bring anything in, but it's necessary to get in there and check on the health of the fish, capture fish for treatment, clean the windows. Lots of semi-science going on in aquariums sometimes. The thing that underlies all my experience with scientific diving here has been instrument maintenance. We've always had instruments out there, even back in the hydrolab days, old current meters and thermistors, and now increasingly sophisticated oceanographic equipment that we put out. But it always has to be cleaned. It gets fouled. It needs to be swapped out. It needs to be batteries. It needs to download the data, into the memory and so on. So that's a big deal. And that's from 4 feet of water in the bay to 65 feet offshore. And then even we supported programs in Antarctica. Chuck Amsler was on our diving control board, and he dives in that little arm that's kind of sticking out there towards South America. That's the Palmer Station on the peninsula. Others dive in that Ross Sea area, the little indention at the bottom of Antarctica. It's actually at the top, curves around to the other side, but you know what I mean. And that's where they have to drill through the ice in order to put divers in the water. Or as I've seen in some slides, they use explosives to blow a hole in the water. That's pretty impressive. We've had to train people all along for that sort of thing. And after those early classes that were, part of a curriculum that Dr. Schroeder and Dr. Crozier started, we didn't have much in the way of organized training. Most of the people were kind of like me, especially. Well, I'm probably the prototype for it. We already dove, we were already scientists, and so it was just a matter of a checkout dive sort of thing. And then it was OJT. You dove with a team who kind of taught you the culture and the skills that you needed. So basically OJT through the 80s. And then we joined AAUS in 92. And I became DSO, and I built the training around their 100-hour course and made sure that everybody got it. But I did it ad hoc. I didn't do it as a curriculum until much later in the 2000s. We offered it to credit so we could charge some people some money for it. And then we actually offered it as a summer program. And a lot of the hesitation in that revolves around that employer-employee relationship, because if you train people and then they go on, they're no longer your employee, but they're still trained. And that's a technicality that AAUS has had to deal with, and one that we avoided by saying, well, we're only going to train graduate students, and that was the case until very recently. So once we joined AAUS, I was kind of like, well, if we're going to be a part of this community, we're going to be a part of this community. And I accepted a position on the board after a while. We also had a former president here as a graduate student. He was a UAB student. One of my techs became a board member after she moved away back to California. And Heather, in the corner there, is really the star of all this. She was a graduate student here, scientific diver, and a member of our student member of our diving control board. Once she graduated, I offered her a job as an office manager, because when I came on the board, the office had been in the Haunt in Massachusetts. And when I came on the board, I offered to transfer the office down here. And everybody thinks, okay, we got this AAUS is, 150 organizations, plus or minus. They think, we've got a building down here. The rest of the world really thinks this. And it was really, at that time, just somebody, with a computer and a cell phone trying to pull all the half time, quarter time sometimes, trying to pull all the pieces together. And that's how it started back in 2006. And Alma Wagner, who's right here, Alma Wagner was a graduate student here as well. I offered the job to Heather, and Heather turned me down because she was working as a nanny, and she didn't want to give that up. And so I offered it to Alma, and Alma took it, and she did it for 3 or 4 years. And when she left, I went back to Heather to ask her to do it, and she said yes this time, and the whole world changed. Things started happening when that happened. So we were really glad to get her. And yeah, people think she has a staff and everything, but it's really just her in her house. That is world headquarters for AAUS. And so I retired eventually, and I was worried, seriously worried. Got any rank and file here? I was worried that the administration here would just shut down the dive program, because it would be the easiest thing to do, right? Let's get rid of something, get rid of the salary, get rid of the operating costs. and just operate on our own. And that, I thought that was a bad idea. So they had hired Grant a couple of years earlier in tech support, and he was a really strong diver. Some of you probably know him. And so I made him an instructor and saddled him with the job of diving safety officer. And so he was here apparently for several years beyond that. That's impressive. He supervised over 5,000 dives. That's a lot. That's a lot. And, you know, he was really good at getting people in the water and doing science. So I think I probably used up way more than
You're
Chris's
fine.
time.
We're fine.
You're good?
Yep. So then Grant moved on and now works at, for the U.S. Naval Research Facility.
Yeah.
And then I'll take over from there.
And then Chris was hired.
Right.
I'm gonna hand the microphone back to Chris.
Thanks, Mike. So yes, I was honored to be hired on here only just a year ago as continuing diving safety officer for Dauphin Island Sea Lab. When I came on board, we still have an active diving control board consisting of executive director, Dr. Valentine, Dr. Amsler from UAB is on our dive control board. We recently brought Dr. Titus on board, and then myself as diving officer. We continue to maintain our diving standards manual and our diving training programs. And yes, I came here to the shores of Alabama from Maine, where I spent 21 years as the diving safety officer in the state of Maine. But really the story continues that we are here to support research, and we have continued to do so. In the tech support office, we support ARCOS, our coastal observing system. We work with scientist Brian DZ on one of the longest standing data sets in the Gulf of Mexico, the focal offshore buoy, and he'll talk more about that. We maintain the Auburn and DISL seawater intakes right here on East End Beach. We continue to dive in the aquarium to help facilitate that process. And then we're supporting all of our MESC diving institutions, right? University of Alabama, Doctors Titus and Hoadley, UAB, Doctors Amsler and Kemp, South near here, Dr. Robertson and others. We're developing out our education and training programs. So we continue dive ops with tech support. We did an on-the-job training diver week last year. We've developed an academic scientific diver training course that ran a session in the fall of last year, and we're just finishing up the spring of this year. And we're pushing out our outreach programs. So we did Discover Scuba for Discovery Hall. I worked with UP to do snorkel orientation and trainings. Tomorrow, we're going to be supporting the DHP ROV program here in the pool. And in that last year, we had 24 divers who conducted 433 dives for over 18,000 minutes underwater. Again, ran 2 full semester scientific diving courses, 5 first aid training courses, 3 Discover Scuba experiences, and 4 snorkel orientation sessions for the entire cadre of summer school students last summer. The story again is about our divers, one of whom I'll shout her out. Sophie just became a national recipient for a Women Divers Hall of Fame scholarship for her work in the Titus, the Hoadley Lab, excuse me. And so then what I did, this is not about me or the scientific diving program. It's about our diving scientists. And so I asked all of our active current diving labs to submit a slide. If I forgot about you, I apologize in advance, but thanks to those of you who did submit. So they are not here. They may be listening online, but first at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, if you do not know Doctors Chuck and Maggie Amsler, then you should. It would be difficult to find another person or persons in the world who have done more diving in and under Antarctic ice than these 2 folks. And they do it from the University of Alabama, Birmingham in our scientific diving program. We recently had the opportunity to have them speak. They spoke to our scientific diving class when we went up north to Blue Water Park in Pelham. Always a great experience there. Closer to home here, University of South Alabama, and Dr. DZ is here. So Brian, would you mind giving us an overview of your work?
This thing, actually, Mike Dardeau could probably tell you more about this site than I could because he was around for its inception, but it was originally conceived as an environmental monitoring program for ConocoPhillips, who wanted to put in a liquid gas plant. Mike, correct me if I'm wrong on any of this stuff because it started before I got here. And so the C Lab got all this money from big oil and invested in it in a lot of resources to do some monitoring. And part of it was this mooring. And when they decided not to put in their liquid natural gas facility, the state took it over, and that's the focal moniker. So the CP actually stands for ConocoPhillips, but they didn't like ConocoPhillips, so they changed it to Compassport. And then Compassport changed into focal, which is Fisheries, Oceanography, and Coastal Alabama, which was a big project from the state that supported the site from 2007 to 2011. Then it went into sort of limbo for a couple of years where it was just sort of strung together by this faculty member named Hyung Park. And he kept it going till 2014 when I got here. I used some of my startup money to keep it going from there. And then we managed to get some external funding in 2017. And we've been able to keep it going on external funding since present. But it's largely a mooring line that's got a bunch of instruments on it. It's got CTDs, so you get temperature, salinity, and then it also has thermistors, which are, you can kind of see the top of the mooring is a ball, and then it goes down. You can see the cable. There's little instruments on it. And the bottom, there's a CTD that collects temperature, salinity. And then in 2019, we got money to add dissolved oxygen. And so that's really nice because I don't know of anywhere else in the Gulf of Mexico that's been maintaining high frequency measurements of dissolved oxygen on the bottom, right? So hypoxia is a real big deal in the Northern Gulf, and it's just largely the summer survey that LUMCON does. And so this is a site that we've been collecting bottom dissolved oxygen at hourly intervals, actually higher frequency than that. We average it to hourly intervals since 2019. And that's, as far as I know, the longest time series of dissolved oxygen in the Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of America.
And a great training site. We just took our scientific diving class out there on Wednesday. And we had the opportunity to dive that vertical array in not blue water, brown, green water. But
yeah, and so if folks have experiments that they want long-term environmental data to understand their experiment in context of long-term environmental data, it's a really good spot to do it.
it's all right. Thank you. I didn't see Kat here. Different Kat. Submitted a slide on her work, and I'm not all that familiar with her work, so I won't talk too much about it. But Kat Freilich works closely with Titus Lab, that has her own independent research and primarily using diving to go get to her study subjects. Anybody here from the Hoadley Lab? Chris, can you give us a quick summary?
So first, mainly I wanted to mention that Grant Lockridge also was kind of instrumental in helping us develop Dr. Hoadley's kind of new tools for measuring coral health and thermal resilience. And so kind of using those tools like the submersible you see on the bottom right, we will travel to places like Fiji, Guam, and Palau, as well as the Florida Keys. And most of what our work consists of is just snorkeling, but they are in Guam right now doing some scuba diving surveys and coral collections like you see in the top right. And we're kind of applying those instruments to these corals that we either collect to bring on land to measure with our instrument, or we take one of those submersibles out and we're trying to kind of identify some fine scale differences that kind of drive corals to be more or less thermally resilient. So this requires like repetitive field trips over the year to account for like a seasonality effect. So there's always research trips getting planned, and ultimately some dive plans getting logged and approved by the board to conduct this research. So it's going really well.
Thank you. Anybody here from the Robertson Lab? All right. Well,
Online.
a little bit. Dr. Robertson came to us mid-summer last summer and needed some scientific divers trained. So our first scientific diver course in my tenure was specifically targeted at her research group. They had done some historical research supported by Grant Lockridge on offshore petroleum structures, studying marine toxicology, but then they took that work to Saba in the Netherlands, Caribbean Sea, And then more recently, this past year, studying sawfish mortality in the Florida Keys. Anything else, Angel, you want to add to that? No? Okay. And then anybody from the Titus Lab?
It's on. Okay. So yeah, we study, like, generally speaking, symbiosis, and in particular the symbiosis between clownfish and sea anemones. And we study that, like, mostly from an ecological perspective and an evolutionary perspective. So we need two things. We need to be able to observe the behavior of the fish. So we use cameras for that. So we just drop cameras and then look at the recording later. And then we need to collect samples. So what we do is, like, collect fish, collect pieces of anemones, and sometimes full anemones, so that we can look at the morphology, but also then bring back samples and sequence DNA to study the evolution of those things. So that's why that's why, like, scuba diving is at the center of any research that is done in the lab.
Thanks. Those were all the submissions I received, but if I missed you or you have something to contribute, please contact me and we will certainly add you. It would be impossible for me to list all of the individuals that we would like to thank. Of course, I'd like to thank Mike Dardeau for being here today, but it would be impossible for us to do that. And so we did not attempt to do so. But thanks to all of the folks, past, present, and future, who support the DISL Scientific Diving Program and underwater research that you are all involved in. I'm trying to compile a list of references for all of these papers and photos that Mike and I found, and I haven't yet done so. But that will be forthcoming as well. So now.